I just learned it's still summer here, so, but you know, in the US we think of September as the beginning of fall. I'm very happy to be here, and I want to thank Anya and her colleagues for inviting me to this wonderful place, Krakow. I know you don't spell it that way typically, but it's been a pleasure to be here and to share with you the work that I've been doing in mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. It would be helpful for me to know first if there are some trained cognitive behavioral therapists in the audience. If anybody has been, raise your hand. Great. Start. I'm going to be skipping around a few slides here and there because if some of you coming to my workshop tomorrow, you'll get the other slides. So as I'm sure you all know as psychotherapists that there are no simple, universal solutions to life's problems. Real solutions involve, you know, broad and stable foundations from which to build greater strength. And in cognitive therapy, we are teaching people a lot about how their own minds function. And so I like this old Japanese proverb, you know, you can teach a person to fish and feed him for a day, or you can teach a person to fish and feed him for a lifetime. I think I said that exactly not right. But so as you know, the topic today is on mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. And so there has been a movement starting in early 2000 of integrating some mindfulness into our cognitive therapy. And it's really, mindfulness training has really taken off. Toronto, in Toronto, Canada, was one of our first studies using mindfulness-based cognitive therapy for the treatment of recurrent major depressions. Training with one of the researchers in that original project, and I really enjoyed it because I had experience with meditation practice, and I really saw the connection between integrating the meditation and mindfulness training with cognitive therapy. In the MBCT, we are combining ancient principles, the ancient principles of Buddhist psychology, developed over 2,500 years ago by the Buddha, and our most modern scientifically tested psychotherapy, which is cognitive behavioral therapy. We now have probably over 400 outcome studies that do show the effectiveness of cognitive therapy for a wide range of diagnoses. Even in schizophrenia, which Dr. Beck, who's the founder of cognitive therapy, his latest book, which was a year or so ago, came out, and on schizophrenia, which is really the ultimate thought disorder. Because they blend together quite seamlessly. Both mindfulness, as taught by the Buddha, and cognitive behavioral therapy increase knowledge of how our minds cause us suffering. And they both give clear instructions on how to train the mind to bring an end to suffering. So I think very exciting is that through the neurocognitive world, they've been able to do a lot of imaging studies that show how the brain changes, and that by using mindfulness or mindfulness and cognitive therapy or cognitive therapy that shows long-term changes occur in the brain. And some of the research has been done at University of California in Los Angeles, as well as Harvard, but some of the other, you know, our universities and research facilities are documenting through PET scans and MRIs and other types of imagery. We can see how the brain shifts with the intervention of these types of psychotherapy. Of you might know, the Buddha went through a lot of self-exploration to eventually develop his form of Buddhism. So he didn't just come up with it automatically or through studying with one person. He was studying with many yogis and using himself as part of the experiment. Beck, as many of you might know, is a psychiatrist, and he was also board certified in neurology, and he was, and is still today, he's still alive, a trained psychoanalyst. Trying to do was to prove Freud's theories, because at heart he was a scientist. And so through his psychoanalysis of patients, he thought he could prove Freud's theory of depression. As he analyzed his patients, that he was not seeing that there was anger turned inward. He was seeing something very different. As he analyzed his patients and their dreams, he began to hear themes of hopelessness, helplessness, and he saw that their thinking was really quite distorted. He observed how unrealistically his patients were thinking about themselves, the world, the future, and he noticed that people had repetitious, habitual thought patterns that tended to be based on some core beliefs that they had developed early on in life. That he was learning and began to develop methods to help people understand how the mind gets lost in this distorted thinking, these unhelpful thoughts, and methods of how to achieve more balanced views of themselves, others, and the world. So he found that the methods that he was utilizing, which was some Socratic questioning, really reevaluating and looking at their thinking patterns, helped to increase a flexibility of thought. And as they corrected some of the cognitive distortions that they had, their affect became less intense, less unpleasant, and calmed down their physiology as well as their overall suffering decreased. Sabotaging thoughts. It says that we're trying to look at the world, oneself, and others more realistically. In Buddhism, the Buddha was trying to do the same thing. Beck used more our higher cognitive functions located in the frontal cortex part of the brain, whereas the Buddha was working more with the sensation aspect of the brain's functioning. Say in MBCT that we are training our minds to change our brains, to change our minds, to change our brains, and it kind of goes around in a circle in that sense. Therapy and mindfulness are ways to really help free ourselves from our own suffering. Both the Buddha and Beck saw that a lot of our suffering comes from how we are perceiving things, often in distorted fashion. And we have a responsibility to work with our own minds, to train our own minds. Nobody can do this for us. So it's an experiential effort. While patients come in to see me, in a way, I'm the coach. They're the athlete. I can help them to train and to think better and therefore decrease their suffering, but it's really up to them to take it on and do the work. So with this kind of training of our minds, it gives us really the opportunity to live in more harmony with ourselves, which is always not always so easy, and also with others and the planet around us. So researchers and spiritual leaders such as the Dalai Lama and mindful practitioners believe that this inner training that particularly we'll do in mindfulness of cultivating a compassionate attitude toward oneself as well as others is a direct route to world peace. So not only as psychotherapists are we trying to help our patients feel better and get along better in their relationships. There are researchers that are bringing this into our public school systems to teach teachers so that they can bring this in to teach students how their minds work and how to manage their own minds. I really like this quote from the Buddha. He said, "Mind precedes all things. Mind is their chief, and mind is their maker." Beck would definitely agree with that. So Buddha, in his first fundamental teaching about the nature of our experience and spiritual potential, was the Four Noble Truths. One is that suffering existed. It exists in life. It exists for all human beings. And that once the basics in life are taken care of, our suffering is really through our own mind and our perceptions. So he talks about the origin of suffering. He says that there can be an end to suffering. And he also showed the path to how to end suffering. In my work, I've tried to categorize what the similarities are between mindfulness practice and cognitive therapy. And so I've come up with 7 that really stand out for me. Mindfulness and cognitive therapy train people about suffering, and that suffering exists, like I said before, and is mainly caused by the mind. Number 2, that we tend to be on automatic pilot. We might also refer to this as mindlessness. Both the Buddha and in Beck's work, what we're trying to do is to train people to step out of being an automatic pilot, to step out of a state of being unaware, and to become more mindful or more observant of what is happening in the mind, but also of our physiological responses and our feelings as well. They both have identified that we have habitual thoughts, like chatter going on in our minds all the time, but the chatter tends to dictate our reactions to everyday life. It has repetitive themes in our thinking, often related to the past, or future predictions, and less so about what's really going on in the present. Both aim to interrupt this automatic pilot and to increase awareness of what your mental activity is and to decrease your reactivity to what's going on around you by shaping more helpful ways of thinking, as we might say in cognitive therapy or more in mindfulness and Buddhism, to decenter ourselves from thought. In cognitive therapy, we explore thought or thinking. And we don't really see thought as fact. And a lot of times, just because we think We think it's true. We don't question it. In mindfulness, John Kabat-Zinn, who developed mindfulness-based stress reduction, talks about thoughts just as secretions of the mind. You know, it's something that the mind, brain just kind of produce. In cognitive behavioral therapy, Beck talks of thoughts are not facts, and we really look at them more as hypotheses to explore and to investigate. But in both, we're investigating and observing thought and thought patterns. And in the last two, we train people in both to disidentify from thought. Why is that? Well, it can be valuable for decreasing some unpleasant emotions. It can be helpful for increasing awareness and to help us with more functional behavioral responses. So we may have a thought such as, that person doesn't like me. We just come up with that thought because of the way they look at us. But it's not really necessarily true or correct. It's just our perception based on a little bit of data or information at that moment. And it can then give us an unpleasant emotion. We can feel angry or anxious. And so if we question more our thinking, we have a chance to maybe better evaluate what's truly going on and have then more functional behavioral responses. Yeah, that's a lot. See what you can do to shorten it. And finally, both mindfulness and cognitive therapy are very interested in helping people to develop a more curious, more investigative attitude toward their thinking in order to weaken harmful, unbalanced thoughts and interrupt habitual thinking that really may lead to us suffering mentally, emotionally, physiologically, and also have us engage in some ineffective behavioral reactions or responses. So those are some of the similarities between them. And this is another quote I like from the Buddha. Wonderful it is to train the mind, so swiftly moving, seizing whatever it wants. Good it is to have a well-trained mind, for a well-trained mind brings happiness. By nature, our mind wanders. It wanders all over the place. Accept that. But we don't necessarily want the mind to be in charge. We want to learn how to manage the mind, but with acceptance about the nature of mind and with a compassionate attitude toward ourselves. It's another quote from the Buddha. And by the way, when I first start meeting with patients, I am working with them with the initial problem, but also teaching them these same things that I'm talking about with you today. And I will use some of these quotes. And so here's the Buddha said, whatever one frequently thinks and ponders upon, that will become the inclination of the mind. Dear. No? And so we can get caught up in what we'll call a bad neighborhood of the mind. Thinking, let's say, negatively about certain things based on perhaps some very significant experiences we've had in the past. Or we can question what it is that we're thinking and begin to explore other ways of perhaps perceiving or thinking about what is going on in the present. So I wanted to also then define mindfulness for you. Let Let me find my quote. So, what is mindfulness? What are we talking about? Mindfulness is about paying attention in a particular way, on purpose, in the present moment, without grasping onto judgment. And to say it in different words, we try to focus in the present, be aware of what's happening inside ourselves, with a non-judgmental attitude. Just a word here for those of you who aren't so familiar with CBT and maybe more psychodynamically or psychoanalytically trained. I was also trained psychodynamically, and so was my cousin Dan Beck. We went to the same schools in New England that didn't teach cognitive therapy at all. And sometimes people think that in cognitive therapy it might be too rote and that we may not pay attention to the relationship. But we do pay a lot of attention to the relationship and developing a connection with our patients, experiencing empathy and showing empathy are all critical, vital part of doing this type of work with our patients. And where I think there's an important difference is that in my psychodynamic training, we looked at the relationship and insight as being very important factors that will influence change for the patient. In cognitive therapy, we think that the relationship and the past are important variables, but we go beyond that because we work a lot with their thinking, and we see that behavioral changes and decrease in unpleasant moods don't just come through insight or through a corrective experience with the therapist. They come from learning to see the world in a more realistic fashion and to observe and evaluate, which is something that we don't necessarily typically do with our own minds. So I'm not going to go into this piece right here, but I'm going to talk a little bit about mindfulness. So we do teach our clients how to practice mindfulness meditation. That also means that we have to practice mindfulness meditation. So you really can't teach this unless you yourself have experienced it and trained in it yourself. So people that practice this, we meditate in meditation halls, or we may do it at home on our own. We, fortunately, therapists can get continuing education credits by training in mindfulness. And again, mindfulness is about observing what happens in the mind without judging it. And it's a particular way of paying attention without judgment. When we usually try to focus on, we develop focus, concentration, and wisdom. I think I've said all this that's up here, but in mindfulness, we're training the mind to settle down. We often use the breath as what we can focus on. It's not just about relaxation. Mindfulness is we do want to relax, but we also want to accept what floats through the mind and learn from it. So it's concentration, it's focus, and wisdom. The wisdom piece is about understanding the nature of mind. So in a breath meditation, we're teaching people to focus on the breath. You don't have to breathe any special way. You just notice breathing happening. It's not very easy for us humans to stay focused. So it's a practice, it's a training. And the breath can be an anchor. So when the mind is crazy and wild with thoughts, this is a way of moving from being maybe even assaulted at times by the mind into the body. And just shift attention to breath. So it's the mind's nature to wander. By the way, it's also the mind's nature to tilt more toward the negative than the positive. And that's okay. We're not trying to really prevent it from wandering, but when we notice that it's wandering, we just bring it back to the breath. Bring it back. If it wanders 100 times, it's okay. You just bring it back. What else this happens, we might notice certain patterns. Like one that I noticed for myself was my mind would go to planning in the future. That maybe I start to think about, well, I'm going to get a cup of coffee when I leave here, and what I'm going to make for dinner, and you know, what chores I have to do when I get home. And then I remember, oh, I'm supposed to be focusing on the breath. Well, at that moment, I've woken up. See, now I'm more mindful. Rather than saying, oh, I'm a bad meditator, I can't do this well, we just notice and observe it. Mind wandered, planning. Because that's the habit, planning the future. We accept that the mind wanders, and then we try to anchor it. Because we can manage the mind instead of being yanked all over the place with whatever comes up. So I liked this quote that I actually heard an NPR, National Public Radio reporter say. I think she was somewhere in some foreign country where terrible things were happening. She said there is a constant in the midst of chaos. And we have a constant in the midst of chaos, and it's our breathing. So no matter where we are and what's going on, we can shift focus and attention to the breath. And it can be very grounding. So this is another practice of managing the mind. We're working, we used to think of this more as, their mind was divided into hemispheres, and one was more linear and categorical, and we did planning functions of the past and the future, and the other part of the mind was sensation-based, being in the present. It's not so delineated, but this is what we're working with cognitive therapy. We're working with cognitive restructuring of that thinking part of our brain, and mindfulness with settling the mind down through sensation, through breath, through focus, concentration. And so I like this quote by one of our famous American writers, Mark Twain. He said, "I've had a lot of problems in my life, and most of them never happened." So this is another place we can begin to investigate or help ourselves out from these, maybe a painful emotion. And one thing is to even just say, drop the story. Like whatever narrative is going on in your mind, you can just drop it. Drop the story. And we can move somewhere else. So we could focus on the breath. We can observe and name sensations. So we can, let's say somebody who's anxious, they're going to often have a lot of physiological symptoms. So it might be their chest tightens. So the focus could be on what that sensation is. So it could be twisting, 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 or it might change. So stabbing, stabbing, or aching, aching. We're moving from thought content the body sensation. And this is a focus, and it's a concentration practice. We might want to also notice we have a resistance to doing that. Like we might know what will be better for us, but we really kind of want to stay with the story and keep repeating it to ourselves. So we just notice that. We just notice, oh, we have a resistance to this. But we can really think of the body and this focus on sensations as a refuge from the wild mind. Body as an anchor. I often teach my patients is the mind is very untrustworthy. It tells us a lot of things that aren't true. And I say that experience is probably a better barometer. Look at experience more for what's most realistic, rather than what your mind may tell you. The behavioral interventions, which is part of cognitive behavioral therapy, we can intervene by trying to change the channel of the mind. Let's change from the anxiety channel to a different channel. So maybe we actually do that by changing a behavior that we're engaging in. So we might move from arguing with somebody to letting it go, walking out of the room and picking up a magazine of some of your favorite stuff to think about or look at. Something pleasant to do. We could do an activity that involves repetitive hand movements. Well, we know that repetitive hand movements, particularly like they're crossing the meridian of the body, help activate the sensation part of our brain that gets activated when we meditate. So a lot of people like to, work with tools, or do knitting, or cook, or build something. This is often a place where we can put our minds where we have more of we're in the present, where our feet are, and it's a more pleasant experience. Another behavioral intervention is we could talk to a wise person. So that might be calling a friend and saying, a lot of anxiety going on, and talk it out with them. They don't have to be a therapist. They just have to have some wisdom. They're not going to join in with you and say, yeah, that person, is a real jerk and you should be angry at them, or yes, you should be afraid of getting on planes because look how often they crash. That wouldn't be a very wise person for us to go to. But that can help us with our thinking. It's often why we feel good talking with friends, because if our thinking is somewhat distorted, they often unknowingly help correct our thinking. Or we may do some activity with them that's, that holds our attention, that we really enjoy. So that could be with a friend, without a friend. Eastern people would say thoughts are self. Western people, Eastern philosophy, I'm thinking more, from Asia, whereas in the Buddha's time, but Westerners or Americans would say thoughts are not self. That's not self. But so it can be read either way depending on your orientation. So Henry David Thoreau, one of the transcendentalist writers in the U.S., wrote this at the 1800s, and is it the 1800s? Some of you may know On Walden Pond was a book that he wrote. And I liked this quote because I think it really reflects mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. As a single footstep will not make a path on the earth, so a single thought will not make a pathway in the mind. To make a deep physical path, we walk again and again. To make a deep mental path, we must think over and over the kind of thoughts we wish to dominate our lives. And so this brings us back to changing the mind, to change the brain, to change the mind. We can create new neural pathways, activate and strengthen different neurotransmitters, and weaken others by having an intention and cultivating a practice. Rather than letting the amygdala, with our more primitive reptilian brain, being in charge, we use our higher cognitive functions to manage our minds and become less reactive. So I think I will leave it there for today. I'm going to be doing a workshop tomorrow. I hope that some of you will come. And I wanted to end it and give a chance to answer any questions that people might have from the audience. And I hope this wasn't too laborious, having translated it, but I thank you all for your attention.